September 19, 1989. A sadistic shootout between military officers and local gangsters led to the deterioration of one of Tacoma's most infamous gangs. Leading towards the day that changed Hilltop forever, the locals locked themselves in their homes, living in constant fear as the Hilltop Crips forced their dominance over the area. The neighborhood street was filled with screams and shouts with over 300 bullet rounds fired. It wasn't until Bill Foulk, a staff sergeant, became determined to protect his home in Tacoma, Washington. And when push came to shove, he and his group of military vigilantes retaliate with force, leading to an all-out assault that had the Crips fighting for their lives.
911, please.
I just want to report what I believe is to be a crack house.
A lot of traffic going in and out. I really would appreciate
If something could be done about this.
at least take a drive by.
This is the Ash Street Shootout. During the 1980s, America was suffering from a drug epidemic that was growing on a daily basis, destroying thousands of lives through the addiction of crack cocaine. Due to the heavy implementation of Reagan's anti-drug policies created to eradicate the existence of these drugs from society, local gangs began dispersing all over the country. The notorious gangs chose to settle down in areas that had little to no policing, giving them opportunities to grow and expand their businesses to new territories. The neighborhood never saw a sight of criminal activity before the 1980s, as many residents lived in peace and harmony, not having to worry about the drug dealers and criminals that infested the bigger cities. But soon, their paradise was going to become a living nightmare as the locals began noticing a few men armed with firearms roaming their streets and selling drugs to the locals. Soon, a few drug dealers became many, slowly corrupting the community and committing crimes like armed robbery, assault, and murder. The fear among the residents of Hilltop began to spread, as they kept their doors locked and windows shut, only leaving their homes for emergencies.
I own the street. Gangs.
The gang ones.
All of them.
Gangs are everywhere. West Seattle,
You can't.
North End.
The gangs that migrated from California made Hilltop their new home and called themselves the Hilltop Crips, spreading chaos all around and establishing crack dens in the neighborhood. The locals tried reporting the gang activities to the local authorities, but due to the lack of resources and funding in the police department, their complaints fell on deaf ears. As the crime rate increased and junkies began winding up on the neighborhood sidewalks, many residents packed their bags and listed their homes for sale. But for those who couldn't afford to leave, Hilltop became a never-ending hell. Upon the arrival of Bill Foulk, a staff sergeant in the 2nd Regiment Battalion, Bill had 12 years of experience in the Army. He knew how to adapt to harsh environments and deal with hostiles when things turned violent. With those characteristics in mind, he wanted to settle down with his family in a remote suburban town. And to his surprise, Hilltop had the most affordable homes on the market. Bill wasn't oblivious to the gang activity in the neighborhood, but rather, he had high hopes that things would eventually return to normal. And with time, local authorities would handle the situation. In 1987, Bill went ahead and bought the cheapest home on Ash Street for $10,000 for the purpose of restoring it for future investment. As the family moved into their new home and began renovations, they noticed that many people were going in and out of the house that was right across their street. Due to the heavy implementation of Reagan's anti-drug policies created to eradicate the existence of drugs, local gangs began dispersing all over the country. The notorious gangs chose to settle down in areas that had little to no policing. With this in mind, Bill would inform his family to steer clear of those areas and pay no attention to them. But a few years later, in the summer of 1989, Bill came back from a deployment mission in Panama with the hopes of being greeted by the warm welcome of his lovely home. But to his surprise, he was met with nothing but misery and despair. As he saw his neighborhood streets littered with heroin needles and street thugs menacingly staring him down, Bill quickly realized that things had only worsened since his departure. But instead of remaining silent, he rose to the occasion and took a stand against the gang's presence in the neighborhood. Bill and a few members of the community formed a gang that advocated against the Crips' illegal activities in their neighborhood. They constantly made phone calls to 911 as a means of alerting them of the dealings occurring in their neighborhood. But just like previous times, their cries were swept under the rug. As the police became accustomed to the Crips' crimes, they wouldn't risk their officers' lives in territories where they knew the Crips had the upper hand. Upon realizing that the cops weren't going to take any action once again, Bill and his group went and expressed their grievances elsewhere, this time in front of the town council. Yet to their surprise, even the council members had their hands tied behind their backs, as they echoed the same grievances the cops had of lacking funds to initiate programs against the local gangs and their operations. When all hope seemed lost, Bill would not give up. Instead, he started to take matters into his own hands. Bill and his neighbors began taking pictures of the drug deals that were happening on their streets. They then started using those pictures as evidence for local media outlets to create awareness about the Crips' unlawful rule over the neighborhood. Bill took it a step further and installed a camera in an upstairs window of his house, which faced the direction of the Crips' main drug den. After collecting enough evidence, Bill forwarded the pictures to the News Tribune, and on September 21, 1989, the news outlet published an article about the Hilltop crisis in their newspapers, those of which highlighted the locals' grievance along with mentioning the lack of policing by law enforcement officers. This eventually provoked the town folks to take vigilante action. After the article was published, the Hilltop Crips went into hiding and halted their operations until the heat from local authorities died down. While in hiding, the gang leaders quickly realized that all the chaos could have only stemmed from one group. And as the days went by, the Crips' hatred towards Bill and his faction grew even more. Bill, on the other hand, enjoyed seeing fewer gang members on the streets. And with the now published article, his hopes of a better future were finally coming back. To show unity against the Crips, Bill hosted a barbecue on September 23rd of the same year. He invited all of his group members, along with his close ranger buddies, to discuss and form future plans that would help reduce crime even more in the neighborhood. But little did he know that his little get-together would stir up chaos among the Crips. As the barbecue went on, members of the Crips began harassing Bill and his guests in order to intimidate them. At first, the harassment from the gang members was from afar. As cars drove by Bill's house, the gang members made gun hand gestures towards the group, making their targets as they went by. But the group left unfazed by the threats. Seeing the group stand tall and proud on the front lawn infuriated the Crip members, so they later began throwing rocks and rotten fruit at Bill's upstairs video camera. Some members even shot BB guns at Bill's house, which provoked the group to confront the gang members head-on and demand for them to stop. During the confrontation, the Crip members told Bill that if he wanted the harassment to stop, first he would need to stop video recording them with his camera. But Bill refused and left without starting a fight. As he was walking away, Bill heard one of the Crip members say that they couldn't wait to murder him and burn his house down. Bill did not take the threat lightly and called for his military buddies for backup, knowing that the threat wasn't a bluff. And it was at this moment he knew chaos was inevitable. After the call for backup, the number of Army Rangers increased to 12, with each Ranger bringing their own personal firearm. Bill told his neighbors to take the kids and seek shelter in their homes. The Rangers went to work and began fortifying Bill's property. With heavy expectations of heavy gunfire, Bill barricaded his front lawn by erecting a 4-inch thick and 3-foot-tall piece of plywood, preventing anyone from entering the property lines. Bill later gathered his team to create strategies for neutralizing the threat. But in order to prevent casualties, everyone had to follow specific rules, which included staking out and waiting for hostiles to make the first move, and if local authorities intervene, everyone will give up their firearms and cooperate. Once everyone agreed to the rules, Bill positioned each soldier in different areas of the house, giving each of them a vantage point from which they took up defensive positions and monitored their surroundings for any suspicious activity. Meanwhile, Bill thought if a shootout took place, he wanted every gang member to know about it and send them a message. So he called a local journalist and photographer from the News Tribune, telling them what was about to go down. Bill didn't bother calling the cops for help, as according to him, they weren't going to bother sending help unless something drastic took place in real time. Bill equipped himself with a Browning high-powering Colt .357 while the Rangers' arsenal included an AR-15 rifle, an M14 rifle, a 12-gauge shotgun, and various handguns. A place that was once called home became a fortress, and Bill was willing to put his life on the line to protect it. As everyone had their sights ready to shoot, a suspicious vehicle began making rounds in front of the house and turned its headlights off. In response, Bill had his house lights shut off and readied himself for action. At 9:20 p.m., the first shot was fired from the vehicle that the gang members were driving, and soon all hell broke loose as a dozen members of the Hilltop Crips began firing from all sides of the house, many taking cover behind cars that were parked on the street and some hiding behind trees and bushes. The Rangers returned the favor with heavy fire, and due to their vantage points, had the upper hand against the Crips. Ash Street became a battlefield, full of muzzle flashes and sounds of gunfire that create a symphony of chaos. The shootout kept getting more intense by the minute, and one Ranger positioned near the upstairs window came close to death as a bullet broke through the window, grazing his forehead and giving him severe lacerations on the face from the broken glass. The Rangers held their position strong as bullets flew right across them, only inches away from ending their lives, yet everyone was determined to protect Bill's property and put the Crips back in their place. As the shootout carried on, one of the neighbors hiding in her kitchen decided to call 911 and tell them about the firefight. Since it was an active crime scene, a patrol car was sent to inspect the area, but as soon as the officer got close to Ash Street, the gang members began opening fire on the vehicle, forcing the cop to turn back and call in for backup. A few minutes passed, and half a dozen patrol cars came rushing in, beginning to make arrests. Only 2 gang members were detained by the police, while Bill and the Rangers peacefully surrendered their weapons. Once the dust settled, no casualties took place, and the nightmare of Ash Street finally came to an end.
But far away from the headlines and the cocaine capitals, come along with us to one city, Tacoma, Washington, in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. One city. It could be your city.
You have a gun now that's ready to use?
Yep, you bet.
There are 50 cars driving in this neighborhood, creating unsafe conditions.
I still got bullet holes in my window.
The Ash Street shootout began making headlines and became national news. Doug Sutherland, the mayor of Tacoma, took the shootout as a learning lesson and began taking steps to reduce crime in the neighborhood of Hilltop by initiating a citywide martial law and implementing strict policies against local gang activities. The Hilltop situation became so well known that external agencies began sending funds towards local authorities in order to increase manpower and resources that would help combat the gangs and clean up their territories. Even Booth Gardner, the then governor of the state, considered deploying the National Guard to purify the streets of Hilltop and other neighborhoods in Tacoma. As for Bill and the Rangers, the police didn't make any charges against them, as the group was acting in self-defense, but were given a strict lecture from the chief of police about not contacting the local authorities before the shootout. The Crip members that were arrested got charged with second-degree assault and possession of illegal firearms, serving 22 months in prison. The shootout and widespread attention it garnered proved to be a source of embarrassment for the Tacoma Police Department. This incident served as a catalyst for the department's chief to expedite the shift towards a community-oriented policing approach, dedicating all the department's newly funded resources towards policing gang-dominated territories. New members were appointed to Hilltop's crime management team, and community liaisons were established. In 1990, the Tacoma Police Department took the initiative to establish an office in Hilltop with the aim of addressing the issue of drug dens. Bill's actions inspired the formation of additional neighborhood block groups and encouraged more members of the community to report crimes, which in turn led to the condemnation of numerous drug dens. Residents of Hilltop had now regained hope for a better future and were able to take a deep breath of fresh air outside their homes without fear. Decades later, the Tacoma Police Department, in collaboration with the FBI, are still cracking down on gang territories in Tacoma, dedicating their time and effort to protecting the local communities. But all this wouldn't have happened if people like Bill Foulk hadn't stepped up against the cruelty of the Hilltop Crips. After the shootout, Bill decided to stay in his home on Ash Street, and make it the home he once dreamt of, patching up the bullet holes, except for one, keeping it as a reminder of the past and what he stood for. After deep diving into the history of Ash Street Shootout, we wonder how things would have turned out for Hilltop if Bill never decided to move in. And will the city of Tacoma ever be successful in completely eradicating the scourge of local gang?